There are mansions in Brazil that were never truly homes. They were empires built on silence. The silence of men and women forced to work the land under the threat of the whip, under the weight of chains, under a sky that offered no mercy and no escape. These were places where power was absolute, where cruelty wore the face of religion, and where the line between devotion and madness was often nothing more than a locked door. This is the story of one of those mansions. It stands, or rather, it stood, in the fertile valley of Vassouras, in the province of Rio de Janeiro, in the year 1847. It was called Fazenda das Almas Quietas, the Farm of the Quiet Souls. A name chosen, they say, by the man who built it. A name that, by the time this story ends, would carry a meaning no one had ever intended. The man who built it was Colonel Augusto Lacerda, a wealthy landowner, a pillar of the local church, a celebrated figure at dinners and civic gatherings, a man who owned more than 60 human beings and slept soundly every night. His wife was Dona Perpetua, and Dona Perpetua prayed. She prayed every morning before the sun came up. She prayed in a room that no one was allowed to enter. She prayed with a devotion so absolute, so relentless, so impenetrable, that even the most pious women in Vassouras whispered about it. Not with admiration, but with something they could not quite name. When the first member of the Lacerda family was found dead, young, strong, without explanation, people reached for the easiest word they knew: fever. But the enslaved people who lived within those walls, who cleaned those floors and carried those burdens and heard things in the night that no one else heard, they reached for a different word: her prayers. What you are about to hear is a story that Brazil's imperial society buried alongside its dead. A story pieced together from a document that was never meant to survive. A diary written in secret, in charcoal, on scraps of cloth and paper, by a 19-year-old enslaved woman named Benedetta. She saw everything. She wrote everything down. And tonight, after more than a century and a half of silence, her words will finally be heard. To understand Dona Perpetua Lacerda, you must first understand the world she lived in. Vassouras, in the mid-19th century, was the jewel of the Brazilian coffee empire. The region had transformed in a single generation from scattered woodland into one of the wealthiest agricultural zones in the entire hemisphere. Vast fazendas stretched across the hills, their rows of coffee plants tended by thousands of enslaved Africans and their descendants, people who had been torn from their homes, stripped of their names, and reduced, in the eyes of the law and of polite society, to property. The plantation owners who presided over this world were called Coronius Colonels, a title that carried enormous social weight. They were the law. They were the church. They were the beginning and the end of every negotiation, every judgment, every mercy and every punishment within their domain. Colonel Augusto Lacerda was 53 years old in 1847. He was a broad man, not tall, with thick hands that still bore the calluses of a younger, harder life. A life he preferred not to speak about. He had built Fazenda das Almas Quietas through a combination of strategic marriages, aggressive land acquisition, and the kind of calculated brutality that the era rewarded without question. He was not, by the standards of his time and place, considered a cruel man. He did not take pleasure in suffering. He simply did not allow suffering to inconvenience him. His wife, Perpetua, was 20 years his junior. She had come to him at the age of 18 from a declining family in Ouro Preto, cultured, pale, with dark circles beneath her eyes that gave her the permanent appearance of a woman in the middle of a thought she could not finish. She was devout from the moment she arrived at the fazenda, attended Mass twice weekly, organized the distribution of religious medals among the enslaved children, kept a rosary wound around her wrist so constantly that by the time she was 30, the skin beneath it had formed a pale groove. The servants, enslaved and free alike, respected her after a fashion. She was not warm, but she was not openly cruel. She distributed food during feast days. She once intervened when an overseer struck a woman named Luisa so hard that the woman lost hearing in one ear. These were the acts that earned her reputation as a woman of faith. But there was the room. The room was in the basement of the main house. A basement that, in a structure like Fazenda das Almas Quietas, was not a storage space or a wine cellar but something older, something that predated the Lacerda family's ownership entirely. The walls were stone. The air was always cool, even in the depths of the Brazilian summer. And in one corner of that basement, behind a door that Dona Perpetua kept locked with a key she wore around her neck on a separate cord from her rosary, there was a room that no one, not the colonel, not the household staff, not any guest in 30 years of marriage, had ever been permitted to enter. She went there every morning, always before 5 o'clock, always alone. Benedetta first noticed it by accident, in the spring of 1847. She had been unable to sleep, a common condition among the enslaved people of the fazenda, who often lay awake listening for sounds that might signal danger in the night. She had crept to the kitchen for water and had passed, in the darkness of the corridor, the small staircase that descended to the basement. She heard a sound. Not music. Not prayer exactly. Not the kind of prayer she had heard in church, the kind with words she recognized. This was something older. Something rhythmic. Something that seemed to come not just from a human throat but from somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath language. And then, between the rhythms, she heard something she would never forget. A name. She did not know at the time whose name it was. She did not know what it meant to hear your name spoken in that place, in that way, in that darkness. But she knelt on the cold stone floor of the corridor and she stayed there, listening, until the sound stopped and the door opened and the soft footsteps of Dona Perpetua passed within inches of where she crouched, invisible in the shadows. She did not sleep again that night. She began, the next morning, to write. What the diary of Benedetta describes in the weeks following her discovery in the corridor is not a descent into horror. Not immediately. It is, more than anything, a portrait of ordinary life on a Brazilian plantation in the mid-19th century, made extraordinary by what Benedetta chose to notice and what she chose to record. Enrique Lacerda was 24 years old and already a man of considerable presence. He was the colonel's eldest son, and in the world of Fazenda das Almas Quietas, that meant something. It meant that rooms quieted when he entered them. It meant that the enslaved workers looked at the ground when he passed. It meant that the coffee brokers from Rio de Janeiro treated him with a deference usually reserved for men twice his age, because everyone understood that Enrique was, in all but formal title, the future of the fazenda. He rode well. He shot well. He had his father's thick hands and his mother's dark eyes, and he wore both with an ease that spoke of someone who had never been told that anything was beyond his reach. He had also, in the weeks before his death, made a mistake. He had gone into the basement. Benedetta writes about it in a single paragraph, with the economy of someone who understood that paper was precious and that writing itself was a risk. She had not been there when it happened, but she had heard it from Simplicio, a man in his 40s who worked in the stables and who had seen Enrique descend the basement steps one afternoon, while the colonel was away in Visuras on business and Dona Perpetua was at the house of a neighboring family. Simplicio had not followed him down. He had waited. After some minutes, Enrique came back up. His face, Simplicio told Benedetta, was the color of old clay. He did not speak. He walked directly to his study, where he remained for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, at dinner, he told his father that he needed to speak with him about his mother. The colonel reportedly laughed. He told his son that his mother's private devotions were her own affair, and that a man with as much land to manage as Enrique would soon have ought to concern himself with coffee yields, not women's religion. Enrique did not press the matter at the table. He never got another chance. 3 weeks later he developed a fever. In Visuras in 1847, fever was not unusual. The region's rapid deforestation had created ideal conditions for the mosquitoes that carried malaria and yellow fever, and the mortality rate among both the enslaved population and the planter class was high by any standard. When the doctor rode out from town, a man named Dr. Ferreira, competent by the standards of the era, which is to say that he did more good than harm on most days, he examined Enrique, noted the elevated temperature and the rapid pulse, and prescribed rest, bark tea, and fresh air. He was not alarmed. He should have been. On the second day, the fever worsened. On the third day, Enrique lost consciousness. On the morning of the fourth day, before the sun had cleared the coffee hills to the east, he was dead. Dr. Ferreira recorded the cause as febre perniciosa, pernicious fever. It was a diagnosis that covered, in the medical language of the time, a multitude of conditions that 19th-century medicine could not yet explain. It satisfied the colonel. It satisfied the church. It satisfied the legal requirements of the death registry in Vesuras. It did not satisfy Benedetta. She writes, "They said the fever took him, but I know what I heard in that corridor. I know the name she spoke, and the name she spoke was his." The days that followed were days of official mourning. The church bells rang. Visitors arrived from neighboring fazendas and from Rio de Janeiro. The colonel sat in his receiving room and accepted condolences with the stillness of a man who had decided that grief was a private matter and that its public expression was beneath him. Dona Perpetua wept. She wept beautifully, Benedetta notes, the way a woman weeps when she wants to be seen weeping. And 3 nights after the funeral, she descended the basement stairs again, before 5 o'clock in the morning, and the sounds that rose from behind the locked door were, according to Benedetta, different from before. Slower, quieter, satisfied. "Now I want to ask you something, and I mean this sincerely. What do you make of a woman like Dona Perpetua? Is she a monster? A product of a world that had taught her that some lives mattered and others did not? Or is there something in this story that defies the easy categories we reach for when we try to make sense of the inexplicable? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every one, and I promise what comes next will give you new reasons to think. You are still here. That means you have understood something about this story that many people miss, that it is not simply a story about a man who died, or a woman who prayed, or a mansion where terrible things happened. It is a story about who gets to be believed, about who gets to be a witness, about what it costs, in a society built on the absolute erasure of certain human beings, to insist on recording the truth. Thank you for staying. What comes next is the reason this story has never been forgotten by those who know it. The colonel needed someone to blame. This is perhaps the most predictable element of the story, and in many ways the most devastating. Because in the society of mid-19th century Brazil, in a plantation household of 60-plus enslaved people, in a world where black bodies were property and their testimony was legally inadmissible, the question was never whether someone would be blamed. The question was only who. It was not a difficult choice. Benedetta had been noticed. She had been noticed because she was sharp. Anyone who spent 5 minutes in her presence understood that she was paying attention to things that other people missed. She had been noticed because she had, on 2 or 3 occasions, allowed herself to be in places where an enslaved kitchen worker had no particular business being. She had been noticed, perhaps most fatally, because one of the household overseers, a free man named Carvalho, cruel in the particular way of men who have just enough authority to mistake it for dignity, had seen her near the basement stairs on a morning when Dona Perpetua was already upstairs at breakfast. When Enrique died, the colonel did not immediately point a finger, but Carvalho did. He told the colonel that the African workers were practicing their religion in secret, that there were rituals, there were herbs, there were curses. He named no specifics. He needed none. The accusation was a genre, not a fact, and the colonel knew the genre well enough to fill in the blanks himself. Benedetta was called before him. She writes about this encounter with a precision that is almost architectural. The size of the room, the position of the colonel behind his desk, the sound of the shutters moving in the afternoon heat. She describes the colonel's voice as calm, almost kind, the voice of a man who has not yet decided what he is going to do, and who is using the appearance of fairness as a way of enjoying the power that the decision will bring him. He asked her what she knew about Enrique's death. She said she knew nothing. He asked if she had been near the basement in recent months. She said she had not. He looked at her for a long time. Then he dismissed her. "He did not believe me," she writes, "but he also did not act. I think he was afraid of what acting might uncover. I think he already knew, somewhere in himself, that the thing growing in his house was not something I had put there." She was correct. But the colonel's inaction was not generosity. It was paralysis, because to act against Benedetta meant opening an investigation. An investigation meant questions. Questions meant the possibility of answers that led to the one place he did not want to look. So he waited, and Benedetta, in the meantime, continued to write. She describes the altar in as much detail as she dared commit to paper. She had glimpsed it once, only once, through a crack in the door during a moment when the lock had been left, perhaps carelessly, slightly ajar. She saw Catholic saints. She saw objects she recognized from the religious practices of the Africans in the fazenda. Practices that the plantation owners tried to suppress but never entirely succeeded in eliminating. She saw photographs, or what she thought were photographs, small portraits in dark frames. And she saw a book, a handwritten book with leather covers, lying open on the altar. She could not read the words from where she stood, but she saw that pages had been crossed out, one page at a time, like a list being completed. "I understand now," she writes, "what she is praying for. She is not asking God for something. She is paying a debt, and the currency is names." This is the passage in Benedetta's diary that historians, when the document was finally examined in the 20th century, found most difficult to categorize. Because Benedetta is not, in this moment, describing superstition. She is describing something she has reasoned out, with the logic of a 19-year-old woman who has spent her entire conscious life learning to read people and situations with a precision that her survival depended on. She is making an argument. She is building a case. She is, in the oldest and most important sense of the word, a witness. Take a breath, because what happened next, in the months that followed, is the part of this story that the Lacerda family tried the hardest to bury. And we are only just beginning to dig. You are still here, and I want you to know that means everything. This story has survived because people like you refused to let it disappear. Thank you, genuinely, for staying with me this far. The best is still ahead, and I promise, what comes in the next few minutes will change the way you understand everything you've heard so far. The second death came in October. Isabel Lacerda was 17 years old. She was the colonel's only surviving daughter. There had been another girl, Mariana, who had died in infancy, and she was, by every account, unlike the rest of her family in ways that people noted but could not quite explain. She was quiet where her brother had been loud. She read obsessively, in a household where books were considered a mild eccentricity at best and a dangerous distraction at worst. She was kind to the enslaved workers, genuinely kind, in the way that a 17-year-old with a good heart and no power can be kind, which is to say helplessly, quietly, at the margins of a system she did not yet understand and could not change. Benedetta liked her. She writes about Isabel with a warmth that is almost startling in a document that is otherwise so carefully controlled, so deliberately observational, so guarded against the expression of anything that could be used against its author. She notes that Isabel sometimes left food near the kitchen entrance where she knew Benedetta worked early in the morning. She notes that Isabel once, passing in the corridor, met her eyes directly and did not look away. These are small things. In the world of Fazenda das Almas Quietas, they were enormous. It was Isabel who first told someone what she had seen in the corridor. In the diary, Benedetta records the conversation secondhand. She was not present, but she learned of it from a woman named Teresa, who worked as Isabel's personal attendant and who was one of the small network of enslaved workers who, by that point, had begun to quietly share what they observed with one another. Isabel had told Teresa that she had woken in the middle of the night, sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, she thought, and had gone to the window for air. From the window of her room, she could see a portion of the corridor that ran along the side of the main house toward the basement entrance. And in that corridor, in the darkness, she had seen her mother. Dona Perpetua had been standing still, completely still, not walking, not moving, not turning her head, just standing in the darkness of the corridor, facing the direction of the basement stairs. And she had been speaking, not loudly, not in a way that could be heard from Isabel's window, but her lips had been moving, and her hands had been raised slightly from her sides, palms upward, in the posture of someone receiving something rather than giving it. Isabel had watched for what she said felt like several minutes. Then Dona Perpetua had turned and walked away, and Isabel had not been able to sleep again until morning. 3 days later, Isabel collapsed at the dinner table. The collapse itself was not dramatic. She did not fall to the floor. She did not convulse. She simply stopped responding mid-sentence and sat with her eyes open and unfocused, staring at something no one else in the room could see. The colonel called the doctor. Dr. Ferreira this time looked more worried. He spoke of nerves. He spoke of the strain of grief. The family had, after all, lost Enrique only a few months before. He prescribed rest and cool compresses and a reduction in excitement. But in the weeks that followed, Isabel did not improve. She stopped eating with regularity. She began to lose weight. She spoke, in the conversations Teresa reported to Benedetta, about a figure she saw at night. Not a ghost, not a monster, but a presence, something she felt rather than saw, something that stood near the foot of her bed and waited. She told Teresa she thought it was Enrique. She told Teresa she thought Enrique was trying to warn her about something. The colonel, presented with this information through the filter of the household's anxiety, made a decision that in retrospect tells us almost everything we need to know about him. He sent for a priest. The priest was Padre Ignacio, a man in his late 50s from the church in Visuras, with a reputation for practical piety. Someone who understood that the spiritual needs of a plantation household required a certain flexibility, a willingness to treat the supernatural with the same pragmatic efficiency that a man like the colonel brought to coffee prices. He arrived on a Tuesday morning. He blessed the house. He prayed over Isabel. He distributed holy water throughout the main rooms. Then someone, Benedetta does not name who, told him about the basement, about the room, about the door that was always locked. Padre Ignacio descended the basement stairs alone. He was down there for perhaps 20 minutes. He came back up without the holy water. He asked for his horse to be brought around. The colonel met him in the front courtyard and asked what he had found. The priest looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "I am not the right man for what is in that room." He rode away and never returned to Fazenda das Almas Quietas. The colonel did not speak of the visit for several days. When he finally mentioned it to his estate manager, according to a letter that survives in a regional archive, he described the priest's behavior as inexplicable. The word of a man who has decided that the inexplicable must be dismissed because the alternative is to take it seriously. Meanwhile, the enslaved workers of the fazenda were doing what people do when the world around them becomes untenable. They were leaving. Not all at once. A mass escape would have triggered a manhunt that none of them could afford. But in groups of 2 and 3, over the course of several weeks, people began to disappear from Fazenda das Almas Quietas. A man named Elias, who had worked in the fields for more than a decade. 2 women from the kitchen whose names Benedetta does not record, only noting that they had the sense I did not yet have. A family of 4 who had been on the fazenda since before the colonel's time. By November, the workforce that had once numbered more than 60 had fallen below 20. The colonel was furious. He sent riders out. He contacted neighboring fazendas, the local authorities, the slave-catching networks that the provincial government maintained. Some of the fugitives were caught and returned, their punishment swift and terrible. Most were not, and through all of it, Dona Perpetua moved through the mansion like a woman in a dream, calm, composed, unhurried. She attended to her household duties. She accepted the condolences of visitors regarding Enrique's death and Isabel's illness. She kept her hair perfectly arranged and her voice perfectly modulated. And every morning, before 5 o'clock, she went downstairs. Benedetta writes, "I have begun to understand that she is not afraid of us. She has never been afraid of us. She is not afraid of anything in this house because she believes, I think she truly believes, that what she is doing is righteous. That is the most frightening thing of all." The diary ends abruptly. This is one of the details that researchers found most significant when the document was first examined. Not that it ends, but how it ends. There is no final chapter, no concluding entry, no careful farewell. The last pages are written in a script that is visibly different from the earlier entries. Faster, less controlled, the letters pressed harder into the surface as though Benedetta was writing against time. Because she was. What happened in the final days of November 1847 at Fazenda das Almas Quietas was reconstructed not only from the diary but from 3 other sources. A letter written by the colonel's estate manager, a deposition recorded and then inexplicably sealed by the municipal judge of Visuras, and a brief passage in a church record from a small parish in the interior of São Paulo, written in the hand of a woman who identified herself as Benedetta Lacerda, the last name adopted, as was common among freed enslaved people from the family that had once owned her, a choice that speaks to the particular complexity of a freedom built on the ruins of captivity. Here is what the evidence suggests. Sometime in late November, the colonel found the diary. We do not know precisely how, Perhaps Carvalho found it during one of his searches of the worker quarters. Perhaps the colonel discovered it himself during an inspection of the kitchen area. Perhaps it was given to him by someone whose fear had finally overridden their loyalty. However it happened, the colonel read it. He read about the altar. He read about the names. He read about Enrique, about what Benedetta believed had happened, about the sounds she had heard, about the night she had crouched in the corridor listening to his wife speak a name into the darkness. He read the passage where Benedetta described the book on the altar, with its pages crossed out one by one. And then he did something that neither the estate manager's letter nor the municipal deposition directly confirms, but which every piece of evidence points toward. He went into the room. He had a key made or found the key or forced the lock. The sources differ on this point and it does not matter. What matters is that he went in. What he found there we know only through fragments. The estate manager's letter, written to a business associate in Rio de Janeiro, describes the colonel in the days that followed as altered in manner. More quiet than was his custom, as though he had received a blow that had not yet fully resolved itself into pain. The deposition, which was sealed before its full content was recorded, contains one sentence that escaped the sealing process through what appears to be a clerical error. The colonel testified that he recognized certain of the items and understood their purpose. He confronted Dona Perpetua. The confrontation happened in the evening. Benedetta was not present. She had already begun, by that point, the process of her own departure. The diary's final entries describe preparations, contacts, a network of free black people in the region who were helping enslaved workers from several fazendas move toward the cities and toward freedom. She was in the workers' quarters when she heard raised voices from the main house. She could not make out words. She did not try. She left that night. Her last diary entry, written on a folded piece of paper that she tucked into the binding of the main document, reads, "I heard her go down the stairs at 4 in the morning. I heard the door close. When I passed the corridor at 5, before the sun came up, the colonel had not yet rung for his coffee. He always rang for his coffee at 5. He did not ring. I think I know why. I think she prayed his name last night. I think she has finally finished her list. I do not know what she has paid for this, or to whom, or what it means for her own soul. I only know that I will not be here when morning comes. I choose life. I choose to walk away from this place with my body and my mind and the words I have written. That will have to be enough." The Colonel Augusto Lacerda was found dead in his study on the morning of November 28, 1847. Dr. Ferreira, called to the scene, recorded the cause of death as apoplexia, stroke. He was 53 years old. He had been in apparent good health. Dona Perpetua lived for another 31 years. She was never questioned in connection with any of the deaths. She managed the fazenda after her husband's death with the help of a hired administrator, gradually selling off portions of the land as the coffee economy began its long decline in the Vasouras region. She attended Mass regularly. She gave generously to the church. She outlived Isabel, who died in 1853, at the age of 23, of what was recorded as consumption, though several contemporary accounts describe a woman who seemed less to have died of illness than to have simply, quietly stopped wishing to remain alive. The fazenda was sold for the last time in 1888, the same year Brazil finally abolished slavery, 3 decades after most of the rest of the Western Hemisphere. The main house stood vacant for 3 years, deteriorating in the tropical humidity, until it was demolished in 1891 by a new owner who wished to build a more modern structure and who told a local newspaper that the old building had always made him uncomfortable, though he could not explain why. No trace of the basement room survived the demolition. No record of its contents was ever officially made. As for Benedetta, the woman who walked away from Fazenda das Almas Quietas with nothing but her life and a collection of paper scraps and cloth fragments covered in charcoal script, her story did not end in November of 1847. It continued for more than 50 years. The church record from the parish of Santa Ana do Parnaíba, in the interior of São Paulo province, is dated 1901. It records the death of a woman named Benedetta Lacerda, age approximately 73, described as a teacher of children, a woman of great dignity, known in this parish for her devotion to the education of the poor. It notes that she had been a member of the parish community for more than 40 years. It notes that she was buried in the parish cemetery, in a plot that she had purchased herself. It does not mention where she came from. It does not mention what she had survived. But attached to the church record, folded and refolded until it was nearly falling apart, preserved in an envelope sealed with wax, was a single piece of cloth. On it, in handwriting that matched the diary, were 2 lines. I was a witness. I chose to remember. That is the only power I was ever given, and I used it. The story of Fazenda das Almas Quietas is not, in the end, a story about the supernatural. It is a story about what happens when human beings are given absolute power over other human beings, when an entire society agrees, by law and by custom and by the convenient silence of its churches and its doctors and its judges, that some lives are sacred and others are expendable. It is a story about the mechanisms that power uses to protect itself. The easy accusation, the sealed deposition, the priest who rode away and never spoke of what he saw. And it is a story about a 19-year-old woman who had no legal existence, no rights, no voice that the law would recognize, and who decided, with a piece of charcoal and scraps of paper, to exist anyway, to witness anyway, to remember anyway. Benedetta's diary was discovered in 1967, inside the walls of a house in Santa Ana do Parnaíba that was being renovated. The owner, a schoolteacher, recognized its historical significance and donated it to a regional archive, where it sat, largely unstudied, for another 2 decades before a graduate student in history came across it and understood what she was reading. The full diary was finally published, in a limited academic edition in 1994. It has never been widely translated. It has never been the subject of a major film or television production. Most Brazilians have never heard of Benedetta. But she was real. She was there. She wrote it all down. What you have just witnessed is a story that lasted less than a year in calendar time, from the spring of 1847 to the morning of November 28th, but whose consequences stretched across decades, and whose silence stretched across more than a century. I need to ask you something now, and I want you to think about it carefully before you answer. Dona Perpetua prayed in secret. Members of her family died. An enslaved woman named Benedetta wrote it all down, at enormous personal risk, and then walked into the night carrying those words with her toward a freedom she had to build with her own hands. And Brazil, the church, the law, the neighbors, the doctor, the priest who rode away, looked at all of this and chose very deliberately not to see it. Who, in this story, do you believe? Who, in this story, had the courage to tell the truth? And what does it say about a society, about any society, when the only person willing to be a witness is someone that society has decided does not exist? Leave your answer in the comments. I read every single comment on this channel, and the conversations that happen beneath these videos are some of the most thoughtful I have encountered anywhere. You see things that I miss. You ask questions that change the way I think about the material. So tell me what you think. And if the story stayed with you, if Benedetta's voice reached you the way it has reached me, then please subscribe to this channel. Every subscriber is a way of ensuring that stories like this one, stories that were buried and sealed and demolished and forgotten, continue to be told. Costs you nothing, and it means more than I can explain. There is another story waiting for you, right there on your screen. It is the kind of story that does not let you go easily. I think you are ready for it. I will see you there.